Well, Laura, you just mentioned the Supreme Court. So let's get into the case that 170 million people would be affected by here in the
Yeah.
United States, of which my wife is downstairs playing and sending me reels from. And that's TikTok. Because, obviously, I don't know how much you know of my background. 15 years as a product manager, working in product and technology, launching the very app that your show streams on with HBO Max and now called Max. But there's something about these social media platforms and content modification, being able to opt into terms of use policy, privacy policies, and things like that. But at the core of this case with TikTok is selling and ByteDance selling to a US based company because of the data collections and the fears around that. And obviously, we know what has happened from a legislation standpoint in terms of Congress. Where do you think this case kind of nets out here? Because this is probably the first one we've seen really attacking a social media giant that happens to be partially owned by a company based in China with US and other foreign location offices. But what do you make of the Supreme Court hearing the oral arguments about this? And where do you think that they will net out in the process of this? And what does it speak to about the larger in terms of social media platforms in 2025 and beyond?
Well, there's a reason the Supreme Court took this on an accelerated basis, agreeing to have the oral arguments back in December and now needing to decide the issue, presumably before the ban goes into effect on January 19th, the day before the inauguration of a president-elect who has said that the TikTok audience and the demographics that of the youth and beyond aided in his successful presidential campaign. So there's taking a step back of why this is here. Congress, as you articulated, decided that they did not want to have this company owning TikTok distributed to so many Americans because they had national security concerns. They believed that there could be instances where a foreign government had too much access to personal information and could exploit it in some way. Well, go to the Supreme Court where they're trying to decide the legitimacy of a ban such as this, where there's First Amendment concerns at play. And First Amendment in the wider scope of things. People often think about free speech in the First Amendment, freedom of the press. That's part of the argument they're raising. Free speech, people have every right to participate in a platform of their choosing and to express themselves in any way. And by trying to ban it, you are, as a government, infringing on their ability to have expression. But the other part of it is association. Do you truly have freedom of association of who you choose to associate with, and also your followers or beyond, and with which entities and companies, no matter who owns it, you have a freedom to be able to do so? Well, there is a history of the government limiting, when it comes to association or the First Amendment, the ability for, say, radio licenses that are owned by a foreign government. There's a history where the United States government does not allow for similar aspects of it because they are fearful of national security or the information sources being able to convey inaccurate misinformation, outright lies, political propaganda that can be detrimental to the United States' national security interests. So there is a history of that. The balance for this Supreme Court is twofold. One, balancing the First Amendment interests of the everyday person. The other is the legitimate national security interest that a legislative branch, co-equal branch of government, has described as important. So balancing these two things, they're not necessarily thinking about the average person who might be making their livelihood off of this, or people wanting to, enjoy the platform for their own reasons. They're thinking about those two primary points: the government's interest in regulating behavior that might have a national security implication, and the First Amendment balance of not being able to infringe. The fact that there are other social outlets for people to have communication might ultimately weigh very heavily on the court's mind. Certainly, TikTok has become very important as a conduit of information, as a platform, but there are other ways that a person could communicate, could freely express, and freely associate. So at the end of the day, the Supreme Court is always balancing the government interest against the public's interest in something and the private interest in something. And from the oral arguments, Mike, it did not seem as though they were really in an uproar over a TikTok ban. Perhaps because they think that others might eventually purchase it, restoring access in some ways. Also, they can't necessarily take it right off your phone and tell you can't, learn your next dance, or who's the girl I love, the ASMR. She's in formal gowns and she's cutting fruit, making her own version of Capri Sun. Love that. They can't necessarily do this. So I think we're going to see how it ultimately comes down. But unlike most cases of the Supreme Court waiting to the end of the term, we're likely going to know that by design and by necessity, even before the inauguration.